I'm now going to formally hand across to Dearbhail McDonald, who you'll know is a journalist and broadcaster who worked with us on the previous assembly, and Dearbhail's going to introduce the next panel. Thank you very much, Dearbhail.
Thank you very, very much, and sorry, Shannon, for moving back and forward. Good morning, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to be with you here again. When we met last month, we had an incredible lineup of speakers who were helping us to set the scene in terms of the lived experience of people who use drugs and the harmful impacts of problematic or dependent drug use on individuals, their families and their communities. And you might recall that we had great contributions from Philly McMahon, from Dr. Sharon Lambert, from Andy O'Hara, who's with us again today, and Pauline McKeown, who all gave us really, really powerful personal as well as professional testimonies, their insights into the harms, the stigma, the shame, the lack of adequate supports, and also that interaction or lack of it between public health, mental health, between the criminal justice system and organised crime. Today, as the Chairman has outlined, we're taking a much, much deeper dive into the lived experience of people who've used drugs, their family members, their communities, and also the leaders in those communities who are really, really trying to help. I spent over 10 years of my career in journalism as a legal affairs editor covering our courts, murder, rape, manslaughter, family law courts, and I think I'm something of a bit of a tough nut, but I've had the honour this week in advance of the Assembly of speaking to all of our panellists, and if my experience this week is anything to go by, and it was an honour, you may find aspects of today's stories that you hear challenging, emotional, and in some cases, as it was for me, quietly devastating. But I also think that you're going to be really, really inspired by their intellect, by their insights, by the courage, the recovery that many have been on, by their love and devotion towards their family members, many of whom they've lost, and their dedication to those who are less fortunate in our society. And as I say, it has been a real, real honour for me. Our first panel is going to look at the lived experience of individuals. And this morning, it's a very diverse range of people that I have joining me. We're going to be joined on stage by someone who was not just born into addiction, but who was born with an addiction, by men and women who have lost loved ones as a result of harmful drug use. Some, not all, who spent time in prison. Some, not all, who lost custody of their children as a result. It's going to be quite harrowing in many respects, but in some respects, these are the lucky ones, because as we know only too well, many people have not survived to share and tell their story. So what I've tried to tell all of our panellists today is that they are the authors and editors of their own story. They're going to be challenging stories to tell, but I'm so privileged that they're doing so. Please give a warm welcome to Carl Takei, Gillian O'Donnell, Shannon Connors and Fionn Connolly-Sexton. It's great to have them all with us. Gillian, I'm going to start with you because you're in recovery. You've trained in addiction recovery and you're hoping to work as a support worker for people affected by drugs. But you are that little baby that I mentioned at the outset who was born with a substance abuse disorder. Can you talk us through those early formative years that led to you developing an addiction to heroin by the age of 11?
Both my parents were people that had used drugs. I was born addicted to heroin back in the late 70s. We won't go too far into the age, but yeah. So I was in hospital for the first 3 months of my life. Then I went back home with my parents who were in the inner city town during the middle of a heroin epidemic. So we got involved with, the younger kids got involved with running drugs from one part of the flats to the other part of the flat. So yeah, became very accustomed to it very early in life. It was, part of the infrastructure, I suppose. Yeah. But
you were very young to, obviously you were born into addiction, but to have even been using heroin at such a young age, do you think it was a trauma response for you that led you into using drugs yourself at such a profoundly young age?
I think it was like a perfect storm, if I'm honest with you. It was my environment, it was the area I lived in. I lived in a poor community area. Both my parents were people that had used drugs. It was part of the norm where I lived, so it wasn't something that was, back then, you know, a big thing. Nowadays, obviously, it would be horrendous, but back then it was kind of part and parcel of the environment.
Because even your dad, I think, had the tragic distinction of having been one of the first deaths of the heroin epidemic.
It was only out, so obviously on his death certificate, heroin overdose was on it, so it was one of the first of the 5, yeah.
The impact that had on your life as a young person, it set you on a path that ultimately led to you getting a criminal record.
Yeah, I suppose it's like many of my peers as well. There's a point where, you know, something happens and obviously you have to face the consequences of your addiction. A lot of that is would be criminality, and then you get criminalised for it, so that like it continues then throughout your life, because your criminal record is not something that you can actually forget about. It, you know, follows you through, and it, you know, even now I'm facing blocks because of my criminal record. You know, there was an incident there. I was in my own accommodation with my children. I had gone to court for something minor. Like, I do understand I have to take the consequences of, you know, my behaviour, but I think the consequences were too severe here.
Did you lose your children?
I lost my home and my children for a 4-month sentence. I went in and I explained the circumstances to the judge, you know, that her, you know, imposing a sentence will result in my children going into care. She asked me where was my parents, and I said, technically, Your Honour, that's you. You know, I was awarded a stay since I'm like 6 years old. So she basically turned around and told me that it was like, that's not a get out of jail free card. I explained that, you know, when I do come out of prison, my home is gone. So fast forward 4 months later, I left Mountjoy prison with no home, no children. I ended up in emergency accommodation despite being on my own majority of my life. I never became homeless, but as a result of that, I did become homeless, to where my addiction escalated, because I was in an environment, you know, homeless accommodation. Yeah.
What's really interesting is that, like, heroin has defined your life in many respects, literally from birth. But, and I know that you were on methadone for a long period of time, but actually it was a different drug that nearly sent you under. What was that?
It was the crack cocaine. Yeah.
And what was so different about that experience?
I don't think it's actually the drug. I think the drug is a symptom, if I'm honest with you. You know, we can pick a different drug and say it's this or that, it's the other. I think I was around heroin, but I had never come into, like, obviously I had come into contact with crack cocaine, but I think, you know, I was traumatised being in emergency accommodation. I was traumatised after losing my children. So, you know, obviously the addiction escalated, and I tried different drugs that I probably wouldn't have, you know, if I hadn't been traumatised, wouldn't have probably tried, but it took a hold of me, yeah.
For a while. And we'll talk about a little bit what you're doing now, which is absolutely amazing. Carl, you've been to university. You're actually working with marginalised young people in the South Inner City here in Dublin, but you also succumbed to addiction at a very, very young age that kind of might be shocking to people.
Yeah, it's kind of sad even when you look back on it, you know, like that. I have young kids, and to look at them and think that they could end up in addiction how early I did, you know. I'll give a bit of background. I grew up in the inner city, and I suppose my mother and father were hard-working people, you know, whether I felt a bit of neglect or whatever because they weren't there in the house, but they always trying to provide for us. We always kind of got the best. And, you know, I had household level traumas, I had community traumas that I experienced very young that I suppose no kid should ever experience. And, you know, when you go to school, and I suppose, like, school is your primary care at that time, most of your days in school, and you start acting out and you're getting into trouble and you're being disrupted, like what the guys were speaking in the video. You get branded a bold kid, you know. I was looking for attention, basically. And teachers couldn't deal with me. There was no intervention, and they just come in and basically say, you know, the teacher used to grab you by the lock and pull you up, and on you, throw you outside the door, you know. And when you're in that and you're told you're a bold kid all the time, you start to believe it, that you're no good, that you'll never amount to anything.
The message gets reinforced.
100%, you know, and I did start to believe, that I was no good. And, you know, from 10 years of age, there was a lot, like I grew up in an area in the inner city where there was high levels of deprivation, poverty, and not known because it was my reality, but there was a lot of like negative peer mentors around there who, you know, the Tipex tinners, solvents would have been.
Was that your entry?
That was my entry, yeah. You know, and like I was about 11 years of age, you know, and it was an escape. I was in full flight from reality. I was like, you do this, and it's like, I'm gone. I'm out of the environment. You know, it's like it'd be kind of like psychedelics, where it's an out of body experience, and I was just like, yeah, wow.
And did it just sort of gradually build up from that on to stronger drugs, harder drugs, a kind of deeper dependency?
Yeah, like I don't think like that was what you'd call the experimental stage. I was there. I was arrested for probably a few years till I was 13 or 14. Then the psychedelics come in, the acid, the hash, you know, and then like
The ecstasy scene, the rave scene that came in.
Yeah. And I'm smiling like because like I've good memories, to be honest, of doing that. You know, it's like you feel love, you feel like a connection, you know, and like
Belonging.
a belonging, yeah, a sense of belonging, you know. And then, like, the progression from there, from about 14, 15 years of age, was quite severe. There was no holds bars. It was like anything was on the table that I kind of would have took. And it wasn't every day that I would have used the substance. Like, you get the weekends, and then, like, you'd probably use the Saturday, then it'd be into the Sunday, and then the progression over time. And then the escalation of the drugs, you know, when you take an ecstasy, for every up there's a down, and when you're coming down, you know, like heroin was around, you know, and I started taking heroin about 15, 16 years of age, you know, and methadone, there was people, I moved to Cabra, there was people in the area who were looking for money and would have sold them methadone, and I had friends who was doing it, a lot older than me, and then start buying that, you know, and like the days over the weekend turned into doing it on the Monday or the Tuesday, and then like by the time I was 16, my mother didn't know what to do. She brought me to a GP. I wasn't, you know, if you look at the stages of addiction from experimental to
Full blown.
problematic to
Dependent.
dependency, you know, I wasn't at the dependency stage. And when I went to this GP at 16 years of age, she put me onto a methadone program, you know, without trying any holistic approach or anything like that. Like, so it was meant to be a 6-week program. You know,
How long did that last?
18 years, you know. 18 years of like being in this community of like people on drugs that not seeing any way out. And the carnage within that 18 years that I suppose I would have caused to my family, to my community, because I'd done stuff that I wouldn't be proud of for me drugs. I would have ended up in and out of prisons, in and out of hospitals.
How bad did it get?
At the end of it, I suppose, like in that video, and you're talking about stigma, and the guy is really speaking. That got me when he's saying he got off the train, and he sees it in the people, but then people are oblivious. It was the internal stigma, you know. It was the
Internal shame.
Yeah, it was like, you're no good, you're a waste, or you'll never amount to anything, you know, like that. That got so bad. Like, drugs dampened that, I suppose, for years, and when I wasn't dampening that for long, I knew the gig is uphill.
Do you, you lost a lot of family and friends.
Yeah.
And as I said at the outset, in a way it's kind of unique that some people are even here to tell their story.
Yeah. I maintain my recovery. I attend 12-step fellowship, you know, and that's like people in active addiction and people in recovery who support them. And lots of people come in and they don't get it and they die. You know, I lost my best friend 4 years ago, and it crippled my recovery. You know, I've lost 3 aunties through heroin addiction. My family had to go through that. I've ODs, contracted HIV, hepatitis C, and died. You know, still lots of family members out there in active addiction. The amount of friends I've lost is like, I really feel privileged to even sit up here and share my story. It's something that I don't shy away from. I'm proud of my story, even speaking with. I don't feel sad for my story. I feel like my story is who I am, and it's what I do and how I help people.
And we're so glad you're here too. Shannon, we heard it when we met last month, and we've heard it echoed again here this morning, that often it's an adverse childhood incident or an early childhood trauma that sets people off on a certain path. Something happened to you when you were very, very young. Can you share it with us?
Yeah, when I was only 6 years of age, I found a very close family member hanging, and I was trying to, obviously as a child you're trying to process that and you don't know really kind of what it is. And then I had, my mother then obviously had a mental breakdown and stuff over it, so I was kind of handed over to my grandparents, and as much as they could, like, they did the best in the world for me, you know, but I was wild out, like I couldn't, like, you know, it's like, I know it's like what Carol said and what the video said and stuff, but I was always classed as the bold child constantly. And even like when you're being told that in class, I left school when I got kicked out actually when I was only 11 out of school. They tried to homeschool me. I'd run away from the home. My family tried to put me over, my other family over in England, to try and tame me down, say, and go travelling and stuff. But I couldn't even do that. I couldn't do that. So then when I came back home then to Waterford, I bolted away from my family. I got on the Victoria Station train by myself. I think I was only about 13. And I came back to Waterford then. And I got with an older fella, and things just started getting just bad and stuff. And I turned to cocaine, drink, benzos. First it was just a laugh, like, you know what I mean? You do it kind of...
Recreational?
When I was thinking about it, like, I always said, like I said for years, I never had a problem throughout my addiction, like since I was like 12 till I was 22. I said that I didn't have a problem. I was going through a bad phase. Like I didn't believe, like I was, you know, I was in denial about myself, like. But I suppose I was just trying to, I was hurt and I didn't know how to deal with it, you know. And like that then where was I even?
Just, I suppose you were in that denial about it.
Yeah, I was in the denial and stuff. And I ended up getting pregnant then at 17, my son. Stopped everything, tried to really do by the books and do everything. And I got postnatal depression then. And the GP put me on Lyrica, which is a really high addictive painkiller. And then even knowing that I had like substance problems anyway, so I started going back on the drugs. Then when my son was 6 months, I got pregnant again. And after that then I went to the doctor. I said, like, I'm not feeling okay at all, like I need help. I really needed help. Social workers got involved. See, they were already involved because I was in...
And Shannon, the difficulty, and I probably should explain, is that you are a mum, but also you're a member of the traveller community. Where,
I am, yeah.
Like when everybody's been talking about the stigma and the shame and the internal shame, that was an extra burden that you had to carry. And particularly, I think, when traveller women end up in prison, there's a whole, again, that perfect storm of troubles that engulf you.
Yeah, when I was in prison, there was a lot of travelling women in prison and stuff. And look, I'll be very honest about it. Like, people, there's been girls in there that's been taking drugs that needed help, and it's not just because I'm a traveller that I'd say it, because they're travellers, they get longer sentences and they get longer everything. And even when I was through my recovery and stuff, and going getting my children back, I was still stigmatised. Kept on saying, I'll get reunification is coming. 4 years, like, shown clean urines. And oh yeah, here's a sleepover every few weeks, You know, like, when none of that should have happened. Like, don't say it, promise someone.
And I want to ask all of you actually just about what you all need, because Shannon also came through your recovery and treatment and is now helping people in our community. Fionn Connolly Sexton, you haven't been to prison. You're a young student. You've just finished your undergraduate exams. Talk to us sort of about the student scene and kind of the acceptability or not, or the awareness of potential harm or not. What's it kind of like now in terms of the prevalence of drug use?
So for students nowadays, drugs, it's more of an extension of the fun time of going out. You know, like, for many people of the older generation, drugs might be seen as a step too far or a class of their own. Whereas, you know, for people my age who've grown up their lives throughout financial crises, working in pubs, working in restaurants, people will go out, they'll have a pint, people will go out, they'll have a joint, people will go to the bathroom, and sometimes they might have a line of something. So throughout different groups in college, there's a different level of acceptability. It depends on the person, it depends on the group of friends, it depends on the class and the college at times. But in every friend group, I think nowadays, there is somebody who uses some form of Class A drugs. It could be cocaine, it could be ecstasy, it could be MDMA, in either form. So I can really trace it back to the fact that, you know, a lot of us growing up, all of our brothers, sisters, cousins left the country, 2008, 2009. There's a huge deficit, not only of, like, the brain drain that we talked about, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, but there's a massive emotional drain there left. Loads of people's family members left the country. There was a lot of people without a brother or sister or a father or a mother or an auntie or an uncle that could have helped them along. So when you go out to a pub or a bar and you're working a 12-hour shift, you're in the middle of your undergraduate degree, you have absolutely no money because you can't make your Susie go to the end of the month, and you've just got off the end of your 12-hour shift, and your co-workers say, hey, let's go out and have a couple of drinks. I know you're very tired, but if you take a line of this, you can continue drinking and you can continue on. Stuff like that. It started as a way for many of my friends to just keep drinking. Now they no longer do the drinking bit. Now the drinking bit is a bit superfluous. They can go out and they can just do cocaine for a night and bounce around to different clubs, or they can do an ecstasy pill or a line of MDMA. But that is not the way that young people really should be tackling drugs at the moment. It's in a completely unchecked environment, and, like, it really does harm people on the individual group level, because it's very harmful for somebody like myself who's got, you know...
Well, actually, you, like everyone on this panel, you actually have a very, very personal experience because you lost someone to a drug-related death. You might maybe share with everyone. I know you come from a huge family, about 10 siblings, but you lost one. Can you tell us about Tig?
Yeah, so in 2015, my brother Tig passed away on his 22nd birthday following tragic suicide. And Tig, he had mental health difficulties, and obviously as that started to get into the crux of it in his teenage years, he was using drugs as well. And an unfortunate overdose in 2012 pushed him kind of over the edge mentally. And when you take something like liquid MDMA that he took, it majorly imbalances your brain sometimes. And if you've got a mental illness, that can really set you down a path of spiraling, and it can really set you down a path of, like, bad mental health experiences. And what Shannon said about making it all relative and saying that, oh, I don't have a problem. You know, for us as a family, we were just saying, oh, well, he has up periods and he has down periods. And for us, we didn't have that language to be able to convey, well, this is actually a very problematic behaviour. In rural Ireland, there are, you know, community centres are shutting down, post offices are shutting down, credit unions are shutting down, bus routes are getting more expensive and less frequent. There's less of an opportunity to leave your town. So if you're stuck in the same town all the time, working a job that you may not be totally happy working in, or is very mentally stressful, as the service industry is, why would you not take a line of cocaine or take an ecstasy pill or, smoke a joint when you do genuinely feel that you could be trapped, as a lot of Tig and his generation did feel, because they were sort of left behind. All of their older friends were leaving school and being pushed out into the world, to America, to Canada, to Australia. Whereas for people like Tig, he was pushed into the LCA program, the Leaving Cert Applied, and into Youth Reach, which was a huge educational benefit for him. But his first kind of contact with the LCA program was the vice principal calling it "losers can achieve." So already there's a particular class of people who might have mental health difficulties who are already being shunned over to the side.
It's that messaging. Did Tig's death influence your attitude to drugs?
Yes, definitely, but not in the way that you might think.
Why is that?
When I was 15, my first experience with drugs was, some people that I know used them, and now my brother has passed away following a set of circumstances created by drugs. So I was probably as anti-drug as you could get. I was practically the dare child. I was just not at all going to vibe with that. But then, as I got a bit older, I moved to Austria. I got into a particularly abusive relationship, and when I moved back to Ireland then, I started to view drug use through a different lens. I developed a few anxiety disorders, ADHD, which basically made my life hell. As I got into my early 20s, the world just felt wrong to me all the time. And I saw my friends using, cocaine and ecstasy. Now, for myself, I couldn't, because I'm such an anxious person. It'd kill me the first try. My heart rate is already at a resting 99. But when I was younger, I was around cannabis a lot. And when I was younger, I did smoke cannabis. Now, my relationship to drugs has changed ever so slightly, because a member of my family passed away from lung cancer. So I don't smoke cannabis anymore. I don't take it at all. But I can see why you would do that, because if you have a mental health issue and you don't have the skills or the skills to articulate it, or the supports for somebody to articulate it on your behalf and bring you to a medical professional, if somebody hands you a bag of weed and says this will make you feel okay for an hour or 2 hours or a week or a month or a day, you're going to take it.
It is. It's that pathway, isn't it, of anxiety and other things that lead you into what you think is an escape. Before we wrap up this panel, I just wanted to ask everybody just quickly, because the insights and the expertise here from this lived experience is priceless. What is it that people need? Like Carl, you mentioned earlier about which is obviously you're putting into your practice now with young people, with that lack of wraparound supports, holistic approaches to seeing people who are struggling.
Yeah, I suppose at the moment out there, like especially on services for young people, I'm a youth worker. I deal with extremely marginalised young people, mostly engaged in antisocial behaviour, drug dealing and criminality, and I go out and engage with them. The drug addiction is kind of a secondary response to youth work. You're trying to be a positive peer mentor for these kids out there. I think the services that you're trying to get these young people in have a criteria that people need to meet, and it's very hard to meet that criteria. Like even if you're dealing with someone and they're on 100 mils of methadone, you wanted to get them into a drug services and they're taking street drugs, the service will not take it unless you're on like a certain 80 mils or no street drugs or no cannabis in your system. Like there's no support. I was one of the lucky ones that got a bit of support to reduce my use before I actually went to the service that looked after me. There's not much out there that you can feel you can, you as a youth worker and me out there, you feel like you're firefighting. You feel like you're constantly putting out fires and trying to be in the moment with the young person, but there's nothing there long term for the people to come in.
And Shannon, I know it's particularly difficult within the travelling community, because often by virtue of the unique challenges that community faces, they're prevented from getting help. But you want people to keep an open mind about people who use drugs and why they use them.
Yeah, I do. There was something that I wanted to highlight as well, as that people, and it's not even just with travellers and stuff, with all kind of services, the likes even of Tusla, addiction centres, anyone, I think that they should give people the chance, even though if you might have a criminal background and stuff, give people the chance, and if they were in addiction, to help. Because when I had my key worker, when I was in treatment, he was in addiction years ago and was a graduate, and I could only really fully relate to him. You know, like I got along with everybody else, but it's like, it's not, if you read it from a textbook and stuff, they're not going to fully understand you and how you're feeling and stuff, you know. They're not going to really get that emotional
Is that what moved
feeling.
you into the work that you're doing now?
Sorry?
Is that what inspired you to do the work that you were doing now?
Yeah, because if I could, like, I'm only one voice, like, but if I could say to someone, like, there is not enough help out there anyway, but to try, like, you need to want it, you know, you need to want it, but and you need to fight for it. But when sometimes you're fighting a losing battle, though. You really are. Like I said, like Carl said, like I was one of the lucky ones that was able to get TR and go into coal mine and stuff. But there's people out there just crying out for help to get into addiction services and that, and there's not enough many of them. And even if they have one or two slips, I've seen it, like, and even heard about other places and stuff, they're getting thrown out, and I'm after seeing a lot of people dying over it, like, you know, instead of just one little slip and stuff, if they didn't cause any danger to somebody or they didn't do nothing, give them the help. Don't, you know, you're putting them back out to the world where they're going to go obviously back on drugs, back into jail or debt.
And they have all that lost potential. Fiona, I just wanted to ask you, you know, like, I mean, the crisis in child and adolescent mental health services and mental health services generally is well known, but your student years are fairly, it's a big transition in any event. What do you think, just even based on your own personal experience and your family, obviously, that suffered that tragic loss, but also just, you've just finished your undergraduate degree, so what do you think is missing? What is needed for younger people who perhaps maybe the vast majority might do it recreationally and move on, but for some they're going to get into a bit of trouble?
So I think young people nowadays, we need to go easier on younger people. There's far too many pressures on everybody. Like, every generation thinks that the next one has it easier, and everyone will say that their generation has it the hardest. But the generation coming up now that are 15, 16, 17 years old, there are a lot of immense pressures. The cost of living crisis, there are, you know, there's a world war is a brewing, there's a lot of different things swirling around. And we need to understand that people's relationship with drugs doesn't begin with cannabis, it doesn't begin with ecstasy or cocaine. Our relationship with drugs began when we started fermenting berries and yeast many, many thousands of years ago. You can't look down on somebody doing drugs through a pint glass. And that's something that young people need to be able to express themselves, that we need to take this as something that is happening and build our supports around it, rather than to say, oh, well, how can we divert it this way or divert it that way? We need to accept that young people, they will likely do this. And if there's a way that we can support them, we should explore a way to support them. But I think that it's good to get into the mindset of understanding that many, 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 many people in Ireland use drugs right now. Some of it's just drinkable, some of it's smokable. Some of it you can buy in a pack in a corner shop. Other times you have to go to a different corner to buy it. So we need to just understand that young people coming up today, there is an immense amount of pressure on them. Things are more expensive. More and more people want to leave this country. It is really, really hard when every second week either one of my friends has gone away to Australia or America or Canada, and I've already lost two very close friends of mine to drug-related deaths, not including my own brother. So
What age are you?
I'm 23. I've only just finished my undergrad, and I've been to more funerals than I would care to ever even see or hear about. And those are not counting all of the people who I've met throughout my life who've probably gone away and who I'll never see from again. And what I just say to young people nowadays is reach out, make your voice heard, make your story known, and make sure that whatever you do, that you don't just suffer in silence and suffer with the stigma, the internal stigma of I'm the bad person, I'm the bold one. You're really not. There's more people going through this than you might think, and to just reach out.
Gillian, Gillian, if 20 years in journalism has taught me anything, it's that everyone has a backstory.
Yeah.
And you have to see sometimes beyond people's behaviours and what they're doing or what the record says about them. And I know that you're still struggling. Like, you're one of the success stories and your criminal record is holding you back. But given that so much of addiction is, as you really so powerfully set the scene for us, a trauma response, do we just need to meet people where they are?
You need to hear what you need to hear what they have to say. Let them have their voices, because You know, a lot of decision making is made without the impact of the person that these decisions are impacting the most. You know, they deal with the stigma, the shame, the criminalisation, you know, the humanisation. There's a whole minefield out there. So whereas if you meet them where they're at, I know, like, I'm in recovery, and I think recovery is a big word because we're all recovering from something at some stage in our lives along the way, you know. But a lot of people don't get to that recovery stage. They don't get to have their voice. Whereas if you meet them where they're at, you know, and again, I suppose a lot of addiction is a trauma response. In my circumstances, if you dissect my life and you go back to where it all went wrong, it was all that the policies made, the decisions that were made on my behalf, that I never had a choice in any of those decisions. I had to just go along with the decisions and deal with the consequences, and those consequences impacted my life like they do the majority of my peer that you have seen in that video. These are the impact of the structure designs and the systems that are making all these decisions. These are the casualties of those decision making. You know, I think we advocate for a more health-led approach to this, because I think it's a trauma response. Addiction, 90% of addiction is a trauma response. If you meet the person where they're at and you go back through their history, you can pinpoint exactly why and where, you know, things went wrong for them. They had to start self-medicating, you know, they had to be in high risk in situations like homeless accommodation on the streets, like they're the underbelly of society. Society pushes them aside. Whereas if you meet them where they're at and you give them value, you know, I suppose, with me, I'm only relatively drug free. I completed a detox 7 months ago. I set up due to my role in Ishka, I set up an advisory board in the National Drug Treatment Centre, and you'd actually be shocked, the statistics. You know, people aren't even getting to see doctors, but yet they're being prescribed medication because no one's hearing them, no one cares to listen to what they have to say. So if I could give you any advice, I would look at this as a trauma response. Addiction is a trauma response. You know, recreational use, everyone uses recreationally. Without the trauma, it doesn't become a problem. It only becomes a problem if there's an underlying issue. You know, like what Carl said, you know, addiction is the symptom. What's the problem? What has caused this addiction? To find that out, you have to listen to what people have to say. You have to hear what they say. You know, I think society has this opinion that once someone uses drugs, that they don't know their own mind. I can tell you, I'd be sitting here having the same conversation, which is whether I was using drugs or not using drugs. So if I could leave you with any message, it's to meet people where they are and hear what they have to say, because, you know, they're not the problem, they're the solution. They have the answers, but it's like, what way can I explain this to you? Most, you know, if you're setting up a hotel, you listen to people that are using the hotel, but yet all these services that are set up for people that use drugs, they don't take on board their feedback or what they have to say about the services that they're accessing and that are impacting their lives on a daily basis. So, yeah.
And we might get a chance, I'm going to hand you over back to Paul shortly just to for your roundtable discussions, but we will be coming back for the question and answer session, and we'd really appreciate all of the questions they have, because there are solutions on this stage. I can tell you, just on behalf of the Assembly members and to anyone who is tuning in, I want to thank each and every one of you for your courage in speaking to us today, to condolences for all the loss that you've had, and thank you so much. And we'll come back. I think, Paul, is in about 15 minutes. I'll hand back to you.